Okay, may I please introduce Cathy Jones, the chair of ECF.
Thanks very much, Charlotte, and welcome everybody. This is hopefully going to be a very, well, I'm sure it is going to be a very interesting conversation, what is for us this evening, and for some of you I know, or for many of you this morning. I did want to welcome our speakers, and I also wanted to welcome all of our guests. We've got an eclectic mix of private and public sector and not-for-profit organisations represented from both the UK and Australia. So it's great to have you all with us. As we do in Australia, what I would like to do at this point is acknowledge the traditional owners of our land and their elders, past, present and future, and acknowledge that many of us are meeting on different tribal lands from different peoples of the Gadigal Nation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our 5 speakers for today. The topic, as we talked about, is building resilient societies around social infrastructure. And so we have from our speakers today, both policy people as well as people that are doing the implementation. So I think that will bring us interesting perspectives around that. The concept of where social infrastructure sits in the policy framework in our post-COVID world. So our first speaker is Nick Yandel, who's the head of programs at the UK Infrastructure and Projects Authority. In response, we have Jonathan Cartledge who's the Director of Policy and Research at Infrastructure Australia. Eugene Prinsloo, who is the Development Director at Community Health Partnerships in the UK, part of the NHS. Anthony Manning, who is the CEO at School Infrastructure New South Wales. And Lara Newman, who's the Chief Executive of Located, which is the government-owned property company responsible for buying and developing sites for free schools in England. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of the technical details for today. We are recording the session, so please keep that in mind. And please forgive my friends at ECF for assuming that that you're all in the morning, because many of us are actually in the evening. So any questions that you have, so please think about asking your questions as we go through, because we do have the 5 speakers, even though they're going to give their 5-minute take on the topic. And so you know, whilst you're listening to what they have to say, please put your questions into the chat room. And also, so if you could hold your live questions until we have a discussion time at the back end of this hour. And what I'll try to do is to get you in to ask those questions or reference the chat room, which is why I'm keen for you to go to the chat room whilst people are talking. And as I said, this is going to be recorded, and it'll be available on ECF's social media channels, including LinkedIn and Twitter. So without much further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce our first speaker, Nick. So I think we've got, yes, there we go. So Nick is, as I said before, is the head of programs at the UK's Infrastructure and Projects Authority. So for those of you that aren't aware, the authority is the UK government's centre of expertise for infrastructure and major projects, and works closely with the UK Cabinet Office and the Treasury on all things UK infrastructure. Nick has worked with the authority for almost 3 years now, having joined the organisation after a stint at the National Housing Federation. He leads on the Transforming Infrastructure Performance Program, and that its aim is to drive better value and outcomes through public investment in infrastructure. So very keen to hear your thoughts on social infrastructure and the positioning of that in your program of works. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Kathy, and good morning / good evening, everyone. Good morning from me in London. So that's a brilliant introduction. I will get straight to it in terms of I've got one slide that I'm going to talk through, and essentially I'll set out what we see as being some of the challenges for delivering social infrastructure in the UK, but also some of the big opportunities, and then how UK government has been responding to those to date, and what some of our plans are for the future. So. As Kathy mentioned, we in the IPA, we exist to both support the delivery of major projects and programmes across government, but also to advise particularly ministers in the Treasury on infrastructure delivery in particular. And in the last 2 to 3 years since I've been working here, a huge amount of that focus has been on social infrastructure and some of our major social infrastructure programmes. I think the reason for that is that we've seen across, whether it's hospitals, schools, prisons, housing is a slightly challenging and more complex area, but certainly the first three, we've got a real increase in demand for provision, and that's been building over a significant amount of time. Aligned to that, we've got, particularly in, say, the prison estate, but also some of the other parts of the estate, some really kind of historic assets that perhaps kind of date back to the Victorian times, if not further, and have been subject to a mixed record of strategic investment, shall we say. I'm sure others on the call will recognise the challenges of ensuring, excuse me, effective maintenance in times of financial austerity. So those challenges have combined to create a situation where significant investment is needed, both in the existing estate and in providing new assets. Aligned to that, something which we've been I guess seeking to address for a long time in the UK is some market capacity constraints in our construction sector. So not only in terms of the number of firms that have the balance sheet potential and capacity to take on some of our largest programs, but also in the provision and skills of the workforce, and in the productivity that's being achieved in the industry. And we've seen that productivity has lagged behind comparable industries, whether that's manufacturing or the aeronautical industry, etc., for a number of years. And then I guess the last challenge really is the kind of complex policy objectives that we are now front and centre to government's thinking. So it isn't merely about building new assets or improving existing ones. We've got a huge focus on net zero carbon by 2050. We've got ambitions to replenish and renew our natural environment, as well as delivering new assets. And we've got a real focus on levelling up across the country, so reducing inequalities in economic outcomes. So I think that combines to create a really challenging picture. But nonetheless, there are some significant opportunities too. So whether it's across schools, prisons or hospitals, these are long-term programmes where we can give the industry visibility of that pipeline, and we can think quite differently about the delivery models that we want to use in order to deliver that significant investment in that pipeline. Aligned to that, we're doing a huge amount of work on standardisation and innovation. So if we know we're going to be building, say, 50 schools a year for the next 10 years, I know the Department for Education have done significant work in trying to standardise those designs so that industry can innovate more effectively using modern methods of construction and other technologies to drive better value through delivery. And then also thinking about different delivery models. So in the prison space, our Ministry of Justice has just recently put out a new alliance contract. So for the new prisons that are going to be built before the end of the decade, they've got 4 main contractors who are going to be collaborating through an alliance to share their learning and deliver better outcomes over the course of that programme. So there's some of the challenges, some of the opportunities we see in the UK. The response so far that we've got listed at the bottom of this slide. So we've got, on the one hand, kind of run out of our treasury. So our finance department has been Project Speed, which has been very much focused on unblocking barriers to delivery, real focus on accelerating and delivery, whilst also ensuring it's aligned with our net zero targets. That's ongoing. The programme that I lead out of the IPA, which is more focused on long-term transformation, and we published a new vision to 2030 in September of last year, which is really looking at aligning the societal outcomes that we want to achieve through our interventions in the built environment, and then ensuring that we use delivery models and technology to make them happen. And then similarly, the Cabinet Office at the end of 2020 published the Construction Playbook, which is commercial guidance on best practice in delivering public works, and so which is super relevant to our major social infrastructure programmes. Now, I make that just under 5 minutes, so I will pause there, Kathy, and And thank you for, it's great to be here. Look forward to the discussion.
And thanks very much, Nick. I know that our next speaker will, many of those topics that you've raised in that introductory slide are actually near and dear to the heart of the Infrastructure Australia crowd. Jonathan's going to give a little bit of a background to that, to us. In particular, I know that he's looking at market capacity constraints and productivity, so I'm sure that will feature in his 5 minutes as well. Just to give you a brief intro to Jonathan, he's the Director of Policy and Research Infrastructure at Infrastructure Australia. And I think I've known Jonathan longer than anybody here on any of these, so we've worked together at the Green Building Council, Consult Australia, and then before that he worked at the UK Financial Services Authority. So it's great to have you here and representing Infrastructure Australia, which is a hugely influential policy making organisation in our Commonwealth government sphere. They regularly release reports covering topics like market capacity, pipeline and resilience, and they help shape to the debate about things like productivity and market capacity. And I know that Anthony Manning, who's on the call, and his team have also made significant contributions to the Infrastructure Australia thinking on social infrastructure. So, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy, and indeed great to collaborate across all of those organisations over the years, and indeed thanks for bringing together this panel across continents, as it were, which is another example, I think, of the collaboration that we're really pleased to support within our remit at Infrastructure Australia, both nationally in the work that we've done with Anthony, and a shout out to the leading work that Schools Infrastructure is doing, as Anthony will talk through that, but also with IPA and the complementarity with themes and issues and reform agendas as it's prosecuted in both the UK through IPA, but also nationally with Infrastructure Australia, is significant and is really driving change, I think, across continents, as it were. So a quick run through really of our focus and current policy agenda, a bit about who we are. As you note, we're the National Infrastructure Advisor, looking at providing evidence-based policy across industry and the community with state and territory governments and across the Australian government to support better outcomes from infrastructure investments. And we do that by supporting the assessment of business cases to support the identification of national infrastructure priorities through our regular infrastructure priority list, but also in my area of work through the policy and reform agenda, and also how we monitor market conditions and capacity in the delivery of what is, as we see it internationally, but also in Australia, a very ambitious and really record-setting pipeline of future infrastructure investment. And to that end, I was interested to position, and in the next slide, through our work last year in delivering the Australian Infrastructure Plan, position some of the issues that I'm sure we'll discuss today around social infrastructure, also within the context of the broader infrastructure sectors in which we operate. So our Australian Infrastructure Plan takes a 15-year view of reform priorities to support infrastructure delivery across the 6 sectors of waste, energy, telecommunications, transport, and social infrastructure. For the first time, we've included social infrastructure within the Australian Infrastructure Plan, recognising its significance in terms of investment, its overlap with those other infrastructure sectors, and the outcomes it delivers on the ground for communities. Alongside that, and I think reflecting many of the issues that Nick touched on, we also look at themes associated with place-based outcomes, which is very similar to the levelling up agenda when we look at some of the issues emerging in relation to place across Australia's very diverse geographies. We look very closely at issues associated with sustainability and resilience and dealing with what is an increasingly uncertain environment for infrastructure delivery. And alongside that, how we better deliver infrastructure to ensure and deliver productivity, get more value from our infrastructure assets, and ensure that the industry itself is as productive and effective as it can be. And what we see through the plan as we developed reform recommendations in this next slide is a number of different themes emerging, whether it's about how we respond to change, uncertainty, or risk, whether it's about how we harness technology and what is effectively a moment of digitalization in a post-COVID environment, whether it's about how we deliver those value for money outcomes and balance that with minimum service levels, which is particularly relevant in a social infrastructure context, or whether it's about how we better use data to support accountability in the delivery of infrastructure and to support better outcomes for users. All of this leads us through the Australian Infrastructure Plan and outlined in a very brief summary in the next slide, a range of recommendations that we take forward. And these range from everything to how we deliver sustainability and resilience, how we support industry and better project outcomes on the ground, how we better manage portfolios of investment to support industry planning for that pipeline of infrastructure projects that are on the horizon, how we establish a transition to a net zero future, support safe and secure water supplies, promote equality through digital service delivery. All of this breadth of recommendations is captured in that post-COVID plan for reform that is that 15-year view of infrastructure through the plan. But with social infrastructure, in the next slide, I just want to make a couple of observations to close out and set the scene for discussion. First, obviously, as Nick outlined, the breadth that is social infrastructure. And while we capture it as an infrastructure sector, in reality, we need to acknowledge the multiple subsectors that fall within that banner and the very unique issues that manifest, whether you're talking about health and aged care, whether you're talking about education, as I'm sure Anthony will speak to it, or whether you're talking about justice or recreation, blue and green infrastructure. So the reform agenda is very much tailored to that, to the particular opportunities and challenges that manifest across those sectors. So, and that focuses on issues like targeting investment in both digital and physical assets, recognising the opportunities that are coming with digital service delivery, both in health and education, but also as we see it in arts and cultural infrastructure. Maximising those social and community benefits by supporting shared use across infrastructure assets, recognising that social infrastructure is part of a broader system and network, whether it be transport, whether it be health and wellbeing, but maximising the value of those assets and recognising the value of investment in infrastructure. Blue and green infrastructure is a great example where understanding and having frameworks that appropriately value the broader benefits that that infrastructure brings is critical to attracting investment over the long term. So I'll leave it there, but very much looking forward to the discussion and thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. That's fantastic. You two raised a couple of really important issues that I think our next speaker can talk about, you know, particularly around partnerships and you know, the whole concept of that social infrastructure is part of a broader system, and that you know, that it's important to share assets and to work together on maximising the value of those assets. And I think we'll be very interested to hear about Eugene's Prinsloo's project. He works as a development director at Community Health Partnerships, which I mentioned before as part of the NHS family of organisations. He's actually working currently on a pioneering planning application for homes for NHS staff on surplus land at a site in North London, and ECF is actually privileged to be a part of that process with him. So Eugene, I'd like to ask you to say a few words about that project and about your thoughts around social infrastructure more generally.
Thank you, Kathy. Good day, everyone. So I think from a kind of COVID and healthcare perspective, you know, COVID has been both a kind of curse and an opportunity for health. An opportunity in that it's really demonstrated how healthcare is, you know, a vital piece of the infrastructure solution that, you know, we need as a society to operate. of course, it's been a curse in the major kind of stresses that it's provided both to infrastructure and to staff. What it highlighted in part is that the infrastructure solution has been, in a way, sometimes the easiest thing to deliver, because things like the Nightingale hospitals were set up, almost overnight. The problem came with staffing those kind of institutions, and where we're facing a global shortage of healthcare workers, we've had to rely on volunteers really to staff those facilities. I think now we're starting to see some of the longer term consequences as well, in the form of burnout of staff and those kind of post-pandemic results. The other thing that we've seen is a backlog in the elective care, which has been put on the back burner while we've been focusing really on funding our way out of the COVID pandemic. From a kind of major infrastructure perspective, the biggest part that we are focused on at the moment is the new hospital building program, where we're looking at up to 40 hospitals across England, and in a bit of a departure from prior years. We are not using private finance for that, but indeed public finance. So, the wheel's kind of almost gone full circle. Many questions around the how you right size in the hospital of the future. How do you respond to, digital AI and other technological advances? Is that going to drive down the amount of space and the type of space that you require? How do we deal with future surge capacity when the next pandemic arrives? If we cut the size of the hospital down and then have to surge it back up again, how do you deal with that in a quick and time and cost-effective manner? We're also moving probably more away from a kind of cure mentality to a longer-term chronic condition management, and therefore do a lot of the patients have to be seen in a hospital setting. And ultimately, how do we make our hospitals as buildings adaptable to new models of care and constantly changing technological advances? We, from a community healthcare perspective, see some value engineering opportunities in that program. In that, from our perspective, we would see only specialist clinical remaining on the hospital site, and a lot more being provided now in the community rather than at the hospital. And I think this plays to what patients want. To some degree, patients are looking for care closer to home. And as a response to that, we've seen the Community Diagnostic Centre program, which has brought MRI, CT scanners and other diagnostic capability that once would have been provided in a hospital more into the community. This is also starting to, deal with the backlog issue around the elective care. Patients also want sites that have a lower infection risk. And they also want to use more telemedicine. If you don't have to go to a site to kind of check in your statistics for the day, then why not just send it from your mobile phone? And we recognize that not everybody is digitally enabled, and therefore we do have to cater for all sectors of society. And then sustainability. COVID really focused everybody's minds on sustainability. The UK hosted the COP26 summit. And partly a response, I think, to that has been the NHS's net zero carbon commitment to 2040. CHP brought forward the first passive house certified health centre in the UK in the middle of last year. And I think that's not net zero, but it's a good step in the direction of. And then we're looking at wider system sustainability, and the key worker accommodation that you mentioned, Kathy, key worker accommodation, recruitment and retention of staff is a kind of key thing to the sustainability of the NHS. And that particular project looks at a whole health economy rather than key worker accommodation for a particular trust. And I think with that, I will probably hand back to you.
Thanks very much. That was a really important contribution. It was great to hear the health side of social infrastructure as well. We're starting to get a couple of questions coming through now. on the chat room. So, you know, I just would like to continue to remind people to post their questions. Just one in advance to get you all thinking is Sarah Nelson is asking, does anyone have a view on where the investment in social infrastructure lifts the value of the real estate around these assets? So that might be something that we might start off with when we talk in the session. So and that's probably a good place to introduce Anthony. Anthony, as I said before, was the Chief Executive of School Infrastructure, who are responsible for delivering school infrastructure across New South Wales. Originally from the UK, you know, but we'll forgive him for that. Where he worked for Turner and Townsend. Anthony was previously the Executive Director of Health Infrastructure, and in 2017 he was appointed as the Head of School Infrastructure, where he's been for the last 5 years, supercharging the delivery of new schools and new and assets. So I think that without any further ado, I might hand over to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Kathy. Conscious that the questions are piling up and keen to get to those bits. I mean, those before me have kind of talked a lot about the kind of the rounded situation in terms of social infrastructure. I think from our perspective, from a school perspective, COVID has been a really interesting process for us. It has very much underlined the importance of schools for both social and economic cohesion. You know, we've seen the disruption with kids learning from home. Certainly today was day one, term one here in New South Wales, and a whole host of parents very excited to get their kids back to school after holidays. No doubt a treasurer very keen to get the workforce back in so that the GDP can keep rolling through. So I think it's been a really interesting piece for us just to see how important schools are in the mix. How essential it is for kids to go to school, but created a real opportunity for us in terms of schools being at the heart of communities. So making schools available much more than simply for kind of the normal, you know, sort of 9 to 3, you know, the out-of-hours school care staff, the local clubs using the schools. We've been opening schools over the holidays, particularly recognising kids have been cooped up when we've been in various lockdowns, and the green space available to us isn't around. So there are some really, really big opportunities there in terms of how the school can do better to serve the community. We think it's a virtuous circle because we think actually the more the school and the community relate better, actually the more kids and the more parents value their school more. And so it's a really important process for us to really capture this. Suddenly schools are very much at the heart of things. We think that, again, we think that the school climate issue, and again, you can map good infrastructure to good outcomes, relationships between kids and teachers and parents as they all begin to value the school. And I think on top of that, there's a really good economic stimulus story. We're blessed, mostly blessed with lots and lots of little schools and a fair amount of big ones too, where lots of work that can be done very quickly. Small value works in terms of upgrades, repairs, maintenance, to get money back into the economy really quickly without needing to go through a planning process or a whole range of others. So a real opportunity to step into the economic space as well and get better value for schools, improve the condition of schools as they go through, but also begin to allow them to morph and change in terms of their roles in the community. So I think COVID has been a really interesting process for us. I think from a school perspective, there's a big opportunity now for us to continue that important role around social cohesion and drive the economics that go with it. And I think that's kind of the key piece outside of all the things that everybody else has talked about so far this evening.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I mean, it gets back to what Eugene was saying around COVID being both a benefit and a curse, doesn't it? You know, and also, you know, the one of the things that I'd be interested in talking about after this is, yes, you know, social infrastructure, because of its nature, can be an economic stimulus, but then it sounds like both countries are actually facing some market capacity and productivity issues. So that would be something that would be interesting to discuss as well. So Lara, thanks so much for being number 5, but you know, we're saving the best to last. And so Lara is the Chief Executive of Located, which is the government property company responsible for buying and developing schools. she has over 20 years experience in the property industry and has operated at the heart of the has been a board director at Clean Slate Limited, a development and property consulting company. And she's worked with some of the biggest landowners, agents and developers prior to that as managing director at Navigant Consulting. And it's great. And she's been a great friend of school infrastructure, I know, in New South Wales, and has made some important contributions to the discussions around school infrastructure here in Australia. So thanks very much, Lara.
Well, thank you for having me. And those of you that, can we go back to the cover slide, please, just quickly? Thank you. So those of you that saw this picture on all the various adverts for this seminar might have wondered why on earth I would choose a picture of myself on my cat's 19th birthday. Well, rest assured that was inadvertently picked up off of social media by somebody who will remain unnamed, but it caused a great deal of amusement amongst certainly my colleagues and friends, and so I thought I'd give a nod to Spike, who has since passed away. He was quite an old cat on my front cover here, but we'll leave the front cover here. What I'll do is I'll come on to the examples at the end if I have time. But again, Kathy, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everybody for having me. Hello everyone, whatever time of the day it is, and a lot of what I'm going to say will back up what Anthony says around schools being an important heart of the community. As Kathy said, we buy and develop sites for schools, but we also provide property development and efficiency advice across the education estate more widely. So that's not just kind of DFE funded free schools, that's FE, that's Dawson board schools, that's the maintained estate that's looked after by local authorities. But on that basis, you can see that I would come at this from an English school system point of view, but not ignoring the wider interaction with other public sector assets and requirements that may exist. So just in the school estate, I'm forgetting higher education and further education. There are over 22,000 schools, 65,000 school buildings, and this is a guesstimate because we don't really know, around 100,000 acres of school land. And remember, this is just England because that's all the DFE and located looks after. And going back to some of the stuff Anthony said, most schools are single use, they're gated, they're often closed outside of school hours. And I'm sure many of you in your neighbourhoods, particularly in the UK, will see that. Lots of kind of fortress-like schools. And that's a real shame because schools are also usually the largest assets and a focus in their communities. And we must broaden the value, how we value schools and how we use them moving forwards. I think there are some really key things that have come together around the pandemic to provide an opportunity to further build on the good work that the DFE, ourselves and other public sector groups have done in this arena. So firstly, there's a great deal of building condition need across the estate that needs addressing. Second, in some cases, there's surplus space in schools and on school sites. So we're seeing local authorities in London, especially, and also other urban areas, predicting significant surplus places for a period as a result of Brexit and the pandemic. So as an example, and this is all publicly available, in Southwark in London, in 4 or 5 years' time, there will be a surplus of 20 forms of entry at primary level. That's not across all primary years, that's at reception. So that's essentially, if you think 20 forms of entry, you know, that's 10 schools too many places at primary. We can't lose those schools to the you know, lost out of the system, because those children will come back at some points. So we need to think about what we do in terms of medium-term use of those spaces. I also mentioned sites, so surplus space on sites. So we're already leading a pilot to free up surplus land on school sites for much needed housing, and this includes what we call building up. So that's brand new schools fully funded by residential development above them with no government or local authority funding required. So what you do is you take an inefficient school on site, make the footprint smaller. They've got a greater amount of outside space in the residential above. I mean, I'm simplifying it somewhat, but the residential above then pays for the school. And then we've got the Children's Commissioner's report, The Big Answer, which some of you will have seen, which has flagged key issues to resolve around child and adolescent mental health, and how post-pandemic schools and school buildings can help resolve some of the issues that have arisen. So think really well thought through education-led mixed-use schemes, think property, community collaboration and multi-agency use at last, because we've been talking about that for a long, long time. I think really, really good commercial meanwhile use until the populations recover. Think future flexibility built into design and delivery now, which I think has been an issue in the past, certainly 10 to 15 years. And I will quickly, if we can whiz on through the slides. I don't know who's, is it Charlotte? Are you, keep going, please. Next one. Just want to show you the one I think we've got next. That's it. So this is St James. Oh, this is St James's Hatcham. So I mentioned building up. I just wanted to quickly show you this. This is a 1 form entry, so a 210 place school, sprawling single story across the site in New Cross and Lewisham. And essentially what we can do here is fully fund and open up that school site with residential above, so that there's no call whatsoever on either local or central government funding. So those are the kinds of things that we need to think about. And I do personally think we've got a lot to learn from what Anthony and his team are doing in Australia. So that's me done.
Thanks very much, Lara. You raise a really important issue there around, or not an issue, interesting idea around mixed use development and how to incorporate social infrastructure into that mixed use development as a way of dealing with funding constraints. Is that something that's being looked at all in health, Eugene, in the NHS?
Well, I think we've moved away from using private finance to more publicly financed. I think health is still struggling, I think, with the concept of mixed use development, and I think it also brings some issues, with regards to how they everybody wants to be on the ground floor, and yet we want to put housing on top of that, and that then gives everybody kind of questions around privacy and those kind of agenda items. And so I don't know that there has been a particular example that's come forward which is as succinct as Laura's in terms of the school mixed use. For the moment, most of the developments that I'm aware of in any case seem to be standalone health developments, which probably, especially in dense urban areas, seems to be a missed opportunity.
So I know, Anthony, you're not here with in your prior role. You're here at school, but have there been any you might like to answer this in two ways. One is there any thinking around mixed use and health? And I think actually there are some ideas emerging now around schools and health and tertiary education precincts. So, what's the experience here in New South Wales?
So, I mean, there is a history. It's not a big history. I mean, go back a while ago, and dental facilities were located next to schools as part of the school. So there kind of has been an integrated mixed use. We've got a school coming in partnership with City of Sydney that includes community facilities, and we were looking at community health as part of that, as an add-on into that space. So I think there are some really interesting opportunities, either from kind of a sharing of infrastructure where the community goes, or indeed from an education and training perspective type model. So we're looking at both at the moment, particularly around that whole issue that the land is getting scarcer and scarcer to find, particularly exactly where we need it, and we can share it quite effectively. But community health is probably the best opportunity, because really it is best located away from acute facilities, right in the heart of communities. And a lot of the clientele, shall we say, of schools would also be very similar to that of community health facilities. So I think there is a lot of opportunity there. I also think they're not hugely specific infrastructure projects. So again, could effectively be office space that's converted to different uses. So it's not like building operating theatres, with big floor loads and ventilation, but actually they're effectively quasi-office uses. And so it could be quite easily provided by the private sector on a leasehold basis for both schools and those things to work their way through. So yeah, there is definitely opportunity. There would be interest from our perspective, because I think there's a really interesting synergy there. And
is there a requirement, do you think, Jonathan and Nick, around a policy response to actually encouraging thinking in this way?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a browse through the infrastructure plan from last year reinforces that view exactly as it's outlined for social infrastructure, specifically calling out the value of precinct-based and place-based approaches, but more generally across all sectors, calling out the value of a place-based approach to planning and integrated infrastructure development, whether it's the location of a park alongside that community and that precinct carries additional benefits. So really taking a systems-based, place-based view is where we landed in terms of the right approach to get the greatest value.
And what would be the UK view on that, Nick?
Yeah, very, very similar. So in the publication that we put out in September, we had a whole chapter on place-based delivery and regeneration, which took a very similar kind of position to what Jonathan's just described. Used a couple of examples, so where we've got combined authorities in certain parts of of England that have got more powers to bring together vast kind of different pots of funding, work with the community to identify what the kind of key priorities and outcomes are, and then deliver much more integrated solutions, and usually deliver much greater value for money as well. Interestingly, so I've seen in a previous life, I've seen this work really well with housing providers involved as well. So whether it's your kind of local housing associations and other anchor institutions who then can, because they are in the heart of the community, kind of as by nature, given their housing offer, and then bring community health services alongside that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of is a nice lead into Sarah's question, which is looking at this from the property sector's perspective. What is the view on where the investment in social infrastructure? What's your view on if the investment in social infrastructure lifts the value of the surrounding real estate around the social infrastructure asset? Is that a reality, or is that something that we just are telling ourselves? I think Eugene, you had a live example that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so the NHS Lift program, which Community Health Partnerships has been leading over the last 20 odd years, has really focused on that part of, where our community health centres are based is in the most deprived wards in the country, generally where the highest health need is as well. And what those centres have kind of shown is that, health and the community clinic that's being kind of placed into those facilities has acted as a kind of anchor tenant. So it creates footfall into largely, what we're looking for are places that are high visibility areas like high streets. And if we can find locations like that, we're bringing patients back through those areas, and that creates its own economic stimulus, which then raises the surrounding commercial land values. And we've had things like pharmacies, etc., obviously come in wanting to be located next to the health facility, and that then sets off a kind of chain reaction. So I think the anecdotal evidence is that putting these centres into these locations, creating the footfall, then creates its own kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, that comes in behind it. And also the regeneration agencies, from local authorities have also looked at, investing in those shop fronts, etc., and putting that visible investment back into the community.
Yeah, I think you were madly nodding, Anthony. So
yeah, absolutely. Two case studies. So we know that inserting a school into a new development increases the plot values. So we know that we're seeing that quite strongly. It's not just the kind of promise of a school, but the existence of a school is kind of the key. And so we're having conversations with a number of developers for whom the penny has dropped, that they can actually sell their units faster and at a premium if there's actually a school there. And so we're looking for them to help us co-invest in that space. So also with Meadowbank, the school and the TAFE project, we've done a piece of work really around the potential ripple effects of that investment. So about $500 million between the two, a brand new 3,000 place school and an upgrade to the TAFE. And Greater Sydney commissioned have done a master plan as a consequence of that. And there's a lot of land around it that was really kind of industrial sheds that really will become office space as the way through. So we do see a ripple effect and a real opportunity. And we were talking to some of those landowners about the opportunity then to actually increase the development and the commitment to some of those spaces and change them on the way through. So I think there's a very real opportunity. I think the UK has a really good history of using health and education to lead regeneration projects, particularly in areas and the footfall that it creates. I mean, the footfall, as we know through the planning process for a 3,000 place school, there's a lot of traffic, a lot of parents, a lot of teachers that would flow through there, all of whom then begin to attract a whole range of other opportunities. So I think it's a very real prospect and something that we need to do much more to recognise as part of what we do and harness, work in partnership with some developers around how that can then be taken advantage of, definitely.
So I think that sort of Mike Nisbet's on this same path, and we have spent quite a bit of time talking about the concept that COVID has been a benefit, in many ways from a community perspective, but it's also, been a curse. And one of the curses is the worsening fiscal position in each country. And Mike Nisbet asks the question, how would you suggest going to make the case for continued investment in social infrastructure? And how does it deliver value for money given that worsening fiscal position? Lara, would you like to have a go at that one?
Yeah, so I think, again, bearing in mind that we come at this from a fairly limited angle, from our point of view, I think what we can do to bring to the party here is this kind of fully funded project where the values are high. So where housing need is high, demand is high, and values are high, we're able to fully fund projects so that there is no call on government. And I think, it sounds like a small thing, but the reality is, what you've got is a situation where our government is pushing levelling up quite rightly, but actually you can't do these projects in those sorts of areas because the values aren't there. So we kind of feel that by doing as much as we possibly can on the fully funded projects in high value areas, then that frees up government funding to go into areas where levelling up is required and where the values aren't very high. But everybody, Jonathan could probably, I'm Nick, say a great deal more than I can about the kind of the more holistic picture, I think. But we can all do our little bit, I think, to keep pushing this, and obviously Build Back Better and all the other things that we're all trying to do post-pandemic are all part of that. So there's definitely an urge and a kind of decisiveness around this angle.
Yeah, so just following on from that, Lara, and this is actually for you, Nick, and Rebecca Willett is asking this question. So given that there are many government priorities running in parallel, and this is kind of building on what we just talked about with social infrastructure and how do you make the case for social infrastructure, and that everyone's saying, we need to accelerate these projects. So how is the UK what initiatives is the UK undertaking to ensure market share and capability? So it's that productivity question again.
Yeah, it's a great point, and something which the Treasury is obviously very focused on, given that they've funded some significant programs across the social infrastructure piece, and they now want to have some confidence that those are going to be delivered, certainly to the profiles that have been agreed. So I think UK government's doing a few things. I mentioned the construction playbook briefly. That's something which I think is going to be a really important piece of the puzzle in the UK, particularly in terms of if we can implement it fully. So that's something which was co-developed between government and industry, really kind of codifying and setting out what good practice looks like in terms of the partnership to get these public works built. And it builds into that visibility of pipeline, longer term collaborative relationships where possible, incentivizing and kind of rewarding value as opposed to a focus on cost. So all of the kind of really good practice stuff that lots of us will have talked about for many years, trying to bring it all together, and then actually it's mandated for all public sector clients on a comply or explain basis. So as I say, the kind of focus there is really on implementation now. I think that would be key. From our side, one of the big things that we do in the IPA is publish an annual pipeline of work, so that again we can really increasing that visibility so that the market can respond. And then increasingly now we're seeing an interest in potentially kind of a government being more interventionist on the skills front, because I think it's clear that a combination of Brexit and other factors are really starting to affect the kind of current labour provision in the UK in the construction industry, but also certainly future demand is going to be significant, and we're putting quite different demands on the workforce given new delivery solutions, net zero, etc. So I think there's certainly going to be more to come in that space over the coming years.
And so one of the things that you mentioned in your introductory words, I think it was you, Nick, was about the importance of standardisation. And I know there's some significant programs happening in both New South Wales. Did you want to sort of flesh that out a little bit? And maybe Anthony can talk a little bit about what's happening in New South Wales as well.
So this is something I think we've learned from some great work that our Ministry of Justice has done in the prison space, but then also the DfE have been on a real journey with this since probably for the last kind of 12 years in terms of standardising where possible, both to improve efficiency, unlock the kind of opportunities for innovation, but also allow you to, I think, focus resource on the things which actually matter to communities and to the people who are using these services, while standardising, some of the stuff that people don't see quite as much. And then it's a real focus now looking forward for the new hospital programme that Eugene mentioned. So if we know we're going to be building around 40 new hospitals, to what extent can we drive a real standardised model, again, where appropriate, so that you can then target the additional resource on those things which do need to be bespoke and respond to local needs. So something which we're pushing from the centre, but again, we're learning from some really good practice in some of our kind of major delivery departments.
And I think, Anthony, you've been talking to the Department for Education here.
In the UK, yeah, definitely. So we've embarked on a kit of parts strategy. So all our schools will be built through a limited use of kit of parts. We'll be overseeing the manufacturing process for those components, and then our contractors will be assemblers. But it's interesting you mentioned the climate change up in Glasgow. I think the Department of Education had developed a similar model, but around sort of heading to carbon zero. And so they were looking, as we were, at cross-laminated timber as being a really big part of that. They'd come out the same idea, but through that kind of net zero, whereas we'd come at it through a productivity issue. But it's essentially the same. We're on the same path, doing the same thing. So we've begun to have conversations about how we collaborate on that, how we maybe use some of the stuff we're doing to accelerate some of that thinking and roll it through. The big difference being we are directly responsible for delivery of new schools. Whereas with the DfE, they've really got to influence the environment for other people. So we see there some really big opportunities to drive value for money, standardising of design, so schools get a much more regular and predictable outcome, but we can actually manage the whole of that supply chain. And again, I think post-COVID, Kathy, one of the things we've also seen is the disruption of supply chains. And so the more and more that we can do locally is good for us, particularly as on the statute books, we've now got the Modern Slavery Act that's come in here in New South Wales. So sourcing things from overseas, some parts of overseas particularly, is going to get harder and harder for us as part of that. So looking to do more and more locally so we can source it and it's sustainable. And then if there was to be just further disruption to the supply chain, we know we can continue through that process. But again, I think that pushes productivity and economic benefit back into the state of New South Wales as part of reinforcing that manufacturing process that we're getting ourselves into. So some really exciting stuff and something we hope to do in partnership with Department of Education in the UK, because we're all, I think, trying to solve the same problem, just heading at it from slightly different directions. But yeah, I think we all seem to now be on the same plan.
So that kind of builds on a question that Ollie Deed has sent to us, and really it's about that relationship that the UK and Australian governments are seeking to deepen, for example, through AUKUS and those kinds of things. And you've just said there's some work that can be done between the Department for Education in the UK and the department in New South Wales. So just a quick, because we're coming to the end, just quickly around the panel, are there other ways that those concerned with social infrastructure in both jurisdictions can work more closely together? So I'll go with you first, Jonathan.
Oh, look, we have really fantastic international relationships and work really closely with our UK counterparts across all the issues that we've discussed today. And all I would say to those listening is reach out from the UK to Australia, tune in to what's happening, and where there are insights to be shared, do not hesitate to make contact. We welcome it at our end and do the same as we enter into the UK. And it's been incredibly productive in terms of our policy and agenda going forward.
Thanks, Jonathan. And your thoughts, Eugene?
Definitely. I think you've got quite a lot of synergies between the two countries, but also differences. And I think those different experiences were at different points in the life cycle as well on some of these social infrastructure assets. And so I think sharing some of the learning as we kind of have to face some of those issues, but also looking across other jurisdictions, to see how they've solved some of these problems is obviously always going to be useful.
And Nick?
I completely agree. So Jonathan and I have actually got a team-to-team coming up shortly, because we recognise that between IPA and Infrastructure Australia, there's a huge amount of overlap. So I think that's going to kick out some more opportunities. I'd also flag, so the Global Infrastructure Hub do some really interesting work in this space, and if it's a good, I guess, mechanism for seeing kind of what's happening around the world, and they put out quite a lot of interesting research and policy statements.
And Lara?
Same. I think, the thing that Jonathan said, this is just about, if there's anything that you've seen today, anybody's seen today that they want to discuss with us, then just shout. And I think we can, despite the fact the geographies are very different, and a lot of what we're dealing with is very tight kind of urban areas compared to in Anthony's patch. There is so much we can learn, and we've seen so many great examples from particularly on the school side as part of social infrastructure and placemaking that we can bring back here. And I hope that the same can be said for the work that we're doing.
And I know you were sort of talking about this before, Anthony, but was there anything else that you wanted to add?
I think there are a lot of opportunities for this. I think the technology that goes around it is the technology that we can all share, regardless of building code and the like. But the digitalisation of design through to manufacturing and a whole range of that I think is actually universal. So I think there are some really exciting opportunities to look into that, even if some of the technical components might be slightly different to suit different jurisdictions. But I think there's a really interesting set of ideas through here that could work quite nicely. And we know that DOE in the UK is using the Education Facility Standard guideline that we've developed here in New South Wales. So again, there are crossover issues like size of classrooms and those sorts of things. If the research is right, it's probably right for as many jurisdictions as possible. I think that gives a whole bunch of transferable skills and experience, let alone componentry, that we can begin to work our way through. So yeah, I think it's really exciting. The more we scratch, I think the more we'll find.
Yeah, I think it's been an incredibly exciting and I've had a number of different messages saying what an incredibly exciting and interesting conversation it's been. We've covered COVID, we've covered dealing, with productivity, we've covered the financial issues, we've covered things like project speed, technology and digitisation. So, and there's many more questions, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to them all. So I would like to thank Nick and Lara and Eugene and Jonathan and Anthony again for being participants in this. I'd like to thank all of you, especially a big call out to those of you that asked questions and those of you that have been participants otherwise. And of course, I'd like to thank ECF for organising this and remind you that the recording will be on the ECF LinkedIn or Twitter page, I think. Yeah. So thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll have another one of these on a different topic in another few months. And thank you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.